Investigators at the First Baptist Church of Sutherland Springs, Texas, on Sunday. Callie Richmond for the New York Times. When Devin P. Kelley turned a small-town Texas church into a bloody killing ground, he also exposed the glaring flaws of the national background check system for gun buyers. Mr. Kelley, convicted of assaulting his wife and stepson while serving in the Air Force, should not have been able to buy guns. But the Air Force admitted on Monday that it had failed to report the conviction, revealing a system that has missed many offenders, from those who have committed domestic abuse to mass killers like Dylan S. Roof, the Charleston church gunman, who was approved because local prosecutors did not respond within a 3-day time limit. A police report that surfaced on Tuesday said Mr. Kelley had escaped from a psychiatric hospital in 2012. Federal law prohibits gun possession by a person who has been committed to any mental institution, but it was unclear if that had happened to Mr. Kelley. Since the National Instant Criminal Background Check System was created nearly 2 decades ago, with the intent to keep guns out of the hands of criminals, drug users, and people with severe mental illness, it has rejected more than 1 million would-be gun purchases. But it is only as effective as the records it contains, and it depends on thousands of hospitals and law enforcement agencies to voluntarily produce accurate and timely information. Even if Mr. Kelley's conviction had been in the database, he could still have purchased a gun in person from private sellers, who are not required to run the background check, an exemption known as the gun show loophole. The case of Mr. Kelley shows one of the system's biggest problems: a simple failure to forward records. At the Pentagon this week, the military services were scrambling to examine whether they had been reporting the convictions of military personnel of crimes like assault to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which maintains the 3 databases that make up the system. Defense Secretary Jim Mattis asked the Pentagon's Inspector General's office to investigate the Air Force's failure to report Mr. Kelley's conviction. Mr. Mattis, traveling in Helsinki, Finland, said that the Inspector General needed to define what the problem is. The problem dates back decades. In 1996, the Inspector General found that the Army, Navy and Air Force were failing to report the vast majority of convictions to the FBI. Federal agencies, unlike state and local ones, are required by law to report criminal records to the FBI, but in 2014, the Inspector General found that the Defense Department still was not doing so. In fact, according to a portion of a report unearthed by Everytown for Gun Safety, a gun control group, the Air Force Office of Special Investigations did not submit any information to the military's central reporting system between August 2012 and January 2013, a period that includes the dates of Mr. Kelley's sentencing and court-martial order. The report said the lapse came from staff turnover and administrators departing before replacements had been trained. When the Inspector General pointed out the problem, it was immediately corrected, the report says, but it does not say whether the missing records were entered. In 2015, the Inspector General found that the armed forces the study excluded, the Army, were still failing to report 30% of convictions. In February, the office announced another compliance review. Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, Democrat of New York, has called upon the Pentagon to review every case in the past 10 years that would have required FBI notification. Laura McDermott for the New York Times. Bruce Anderson, a spokesman for the Inspector General, said Tuesday that the office had also begun an investigation into the failure in the Kelley case, as well as a broader review of the policies, practices and procedures to determine whether appropriate qualifying information is submitted. The Air Force assigned the failure to the small, remote base where Mr. Kelley had been court-martialed. Initial information indicates that Kelley's domestic violence offense was not entered into the National Criminal Information Center database by the Holloman Air Force Base Office of Special Investigation, it said in a statement. The fact that the service branches do not have a dedicated office that handles such notifications is a reflection of how little importance the military places on it, said Don Christensen, who was the chief prosecutor in the Air Force and is now president of Protect Our Defenders, a group that favors greater protections for victims of UAL assault and domestic violence in the military. The Office of Special Investigations' responsibilities are far broader than those of law enforcement on base. Mr. Christensen said they have counterintelligence responsibilities, and they're not time criminal investigators. They rotate people in and out constantly. Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, Democrat of New York, called upon the Pentagon to review every case in the past 10 years that would have required FBI notification. "We do know that domestic violence is rampant in the military," she said. "We do know that the military has a serious problem with domestic violence and victims are not getting justice." Representative Mac Thornberry, Republican of Texas and chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, called the failure to forward Mr. Kelley's records appalling, adding that it may be a systemic issue. The military's 51-page domestic abuse policy encourages cooperation with other law enforcement agencies but makes no mention of reporting convictions to the FBI. Pentagon and Air Force officials did not respond to questions on Tuesday about the frequency of domestic violence convictions in the military or how many of those convictions, or restraining orders that would also prevent gun purchases, had been sent to the federal background check system. While state reporting is voluntary, federal agencies are required by law to report. Of the 3 databases used for federal background checks, only one, the NICS Indices, is dedicated to criteria that would prohibit a gun purchase. The National Crime Information Center includes a host of different kinds of records including stolen boats, the National Sex Offender Registry, protective orders, wanted persons and suspected terrorists. The Interstate Identification Index contains criminal histories. Together, they contain many thousands of records, such as misdemeanor convictions, that would not disqualify someone from buying a gun. The Indices, however, contains only records that clearly prohibit gun purchases. It is possible to see what kinds of cases the Defense Department reported to the Indices. Almost all were dishonorable discharges, and only one was a misdemeanor domestic violence conviction. But such cases might have been reported to one of the other databases, which do not disclose the sources of their information. Even then, domestic violence cases can be among the murkiest. The Lautenberg Amendment to the Federal Gun Control Act prohibits people with misdemeanor domestic violence convictions from buying guns, but only if the offense involved physical force against a current or former spouse, a child, or a person with whom the offender shares a child. It does not include violence against a boyfriend or girlfriend, or non-violent offenses like stalking. So, a domestic violence case involving an assault on a girlfriend would not prohibit gun ownership, while the same charge involving an assault on a wife would. States do not have to tell the federal database whether a case qualifies under the Lautenberg Amendment, and according to a 2015 report, only 22 states voluntarily participated in a program that asked them to do so. Under the military code, there is no such charge as domestic violence. Mr. Kelley was charged with assault, but the paperwork flagged the case at the top, in bold, as one that would prohibit gun ownership, said Jonas Orensky, a deputy legal director of Everytown for Gun Safety, calling the label great court practice. It just never made it into the database. Reporting was contributed by Dave Phillips from Colorado Springs, Helen Cooper from Washington and Timothy Williams from New York. A version of this article appears in print on November 8, 2017, on page A13 of the New York edition with the headline "Church Attack Exposes a Failure in National Background Checks."